Please be seated. Good morning. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be with you here today. And I thank my old dear friend and brother, Reverend Jackson, for inviting me. I've been studying and trying to prepare myself to speak since the day he asked me. For a while, it was nerve-wracking, perhaps because I allowed myself to imagine that I was supposed to come here today and talk to you. But then maybe I began to get a little inkling of what a real preacher like Reverend Jackson must have learned very long ago, that it's not really about a preacher talking to a congregation. Deeper still, and when I say deep, I mean to indicate that what's deep is also really simple. Though it might seem like talking with and not to the congregation is the point, the deep and simple secret is not talking, but listening. That is important. That we come here to listen to one another, and more importantly, to wonder at the gift and blessing of our gathering, in humble thanksgiving for our gathering, in the sight of God and in God's hearing, in this beautifully mutual waiting and listening and attending. So instead of worrying so much about what I was going to say, I started trying to listen. I started trying to remember what had already been given to me to share with you today. Something that really wasn't given to me fully until I heard it as something to share. It's like it's only mine in that I share it with you, since I only really began to understand it, to really hear it, in anticipation of being here with you right now. It's something I heard someone say well over 40 years ago, when I was standing on the back porch of my grandparents' house in a very small town in southeastern Arkansas called Kingsland. It was late August 1978, just a few days after my grandfather passed away after a terrible but brief illness. My grandfather was a beautiful person, the kindest and sweetest I've ever known, and the hardest working. He had recently retired from a job as a laborer at a Georgia Pacific pulpwood processing plant, and we always joked that he retired so that he could work full-time on his garden, or as he referred to it, his truck farm. Earlier that year, even as he'd begun to get sick, he still planted and tilled his garden, but as his illness progressed, he no longer had the strength to fully work it. And I didn't have either the expertise or, to be honest, the will to do it in his stead. He had begun to teach me how to work, but he didn't have time to finish those lessons, just as he didn't have time to reap what he had sown in his garden. And that year, the garden was amazing. It flourished. One man had planted it, but there was no way, it seemed, that one man, even him, could pick it. Everything was big and prolific and bursting. And the miracle of all that life and sustenance to which my grandfather had devoted himself filled us with pride, but also sadness that he couldn't make it to the harvest, but also anxiety over the fact that we were, and that especially I was, incapable of harvesting it, of filling Pawpaw's shoes and taking up his work. Then one day, early one morning, my mom and my grandmother and I noticed, maybe we felt and then heard before we saw, a presence, a gathering out in the garden. We went outside and saw that there was a small group of people, which we quickly recognized as a family, out in the garden picking corn and squash and purple-hulled peas. It was a couple named John and Nancy Brazil and their children. They were part of the same large community of worship to which my grandmother belonged. They weren't members of her church, and I don't even think they were part of the same denomination. They had just heard that Marie Jenkins needed some help with her garden. They worked that and kept coming all through the rest of that summer and into the fall. We all worked in that garden, reaping what my grandfather had sown, sharing the fruits of his labor with our neighbors, freezing vegetables for the winter. It was a miracle, if you ask me, but it was one of those common, ubiquitous miracles of love and sharing. I'm not sharing this story with you because I think you've never heard anything like it. I'm sharing it with you because I know you have. I've been thinking about it, but the harvest it bears is too big for me to bring in by myself. I brought it here today so we could gather around it and gather in it and think about what it means together. But I'm not quite finished with the story. There's one more part. When the garden had just about run its course and all the vegetables had been picked and shelled and frozen and shared, my grandmother became concerned, almost obsessed, with how she could repay Mr. and Mrs. Brazil and their family. She kept bringing it up to them, and they would just smile and say nothing. It wasn't that they weren't responding to her, it's that their response was to say nothing, to say that nothing is what she owed them. But she kept on with it until one day, Mrs. Brazil, who had very quickly taken to calling my grandmother Mother, just said, "Mother, you don't owe us anything. This is how we fellowship." Now, when I say that today, I want to talk with you a little bit about call and response, or as we have it in the liturgy that is given to us in the Book of Common Prayer, collect and response. What I'm really saying is that I would be honored if you would listen with me to Mrs. Brazil say the word fellowship. In sharing that word with you, I think we might be able to really hear it, and I might be able finally to hear it myself. The collect is a call to gather, and the term insists upon that gathering. We are called upon to gather, to congregate, and because it is we who are called to gather, because when we are called upon to gather, it is already assumed that we are gathered. It seems like part of what it is to gather is to think about gathering right at the intersection of what we are and what we do. Maybe we are being asked to consider that what we are is what we do, that we are nothing other than this beautiful practice of gathering, that if we have any identity at all, it is in the first place shared, and it is in some place that might as well be before the first place practiced. This week we are blessed to be called upon and to be gathered here today to reflect upon our calling and our responding, and to consider that these are shared in our common practice. When Isaiah speaks of the gift and burden of prophecy, of having been called as if from the very moment of having been made, let's imagine that he is speaking not only to us but also for us, as if the exaltation of being called upon to prophesy, to be a servant, to be an instrument, even to be a weapon, is something that we share, is a call to which we must all respond in practice, in how we gather, in how we collect, in how we fellowship. Now, there are some highly educated people who are in fact ignorant because their knowledge of language has been impoverished too much by correction. And they would say that Mrs. Brazil didn't know the part of speech to which the word fellowship belongs. But we know, as a function of our gathering in our little part of the great congregation, that in speaking in the glorious black working class vernacular of southeastern Arkansas, which I'm probably too proud to say is my native language, Mrs. Brazil knew just what she was talking about. It wasn't that she mistook the noun fellowship for a verb, but rather that she knew, because she showed, that gathering in call and response is what we are and what we do. She knew that gathering makes a grammar all its own. She also knew that prophecy, which is what we are and what we do, is also what we share. As we recite and listen to the words that are given to Isaiah in the light and sound of those that are given to David in Psalm 40, maybe we can begin again deeply to consider what it is to have been called, what it is to have been or to be collected, gathered. The call is often seen as a moment of deep isolation. It is to be called out of the group, to have something special and particular conferred upon you. It is an exaltation, but so often it seems not also to have So often it seems also to have been experienced as a burden, and often as a kind of shame, as the one who is called is made that much more aware constantly of their own unworthiness and inadequacy, until it is also seen finally as a kind of surrender, a way of embracing the sense of oneself as instrument, vessel, who bears and does God's will. And perhaps what Paul is saying in speaking of those who have been called to be saints, also as those who call upon, and also those who call upon the Lord, is that this gathering in call and response is what we practice and what we are and what we share. The lectionary readings that have been given to us for this week are so beautiful because they invite us to study and to enact the very thing they are also about, call and response, the antiphony of the social and spiritual life we share, this cool anthemic thing that we be doing all the time. The readings call upon us to take note of that, and not only to wonder at it and be thankful for it, but also to consider what form call and response must take for us now that the world is drowning and burning, freezing and melting, starving and engorging itself all at once. How do we make the general congregation of which David speaks? This is a question that seems as much about unmaking as it is about making. It's about tearing stuff up as well as about harvesting. There's all this underlying action, a constant frenzied disordering going on. It's about how the Brazil family's kindness was also revolutionary, a series of acts of common defense in and against a brutal regime. Their gathering with my family and their gathering of the harvest we shared was also a kind of radical turbulence, a turning over of ground that was also a tendency to overturn the order of things that must be honored and unleashed and cultivated. I say this because today is also the beginning of the week in which we honor the life and try to hear again the words of another prophet, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Today, we also can accept the gift of a chance to respond to his call, to call out for justice in echo of his responding, to gather here in the name and in the spirit of justice while in the shadow of institutions that author so much pain and suffering. Today, we don't speak truth to power in power's shadow. We speak this turbulent, cultivating, overturning love amongst ourselves in the light and sound of how it sustains us and what it demands of us. We get to think about what it would be to burst through that shadow, to shine with the radiance of Christ's glory as the collect calls upon us to call for. Answering Dr. King's call, sharing his burden, practicing his preaching, as Mr. and Mrs. Brazil did in quiet eloquence of deed and word, in the beauty of how they fellowshipped, is this responsibility to share what we share out of an abundance that we can only deserve when we give it away.